Adoptee, a word that can be both welcoming and isolating at the same time, especially for an intercountry adoptee like Lynelle Long, who came from Vietnam and was raised by her adoptive family in Australia. Like many intercountry adoptees, she struggled with concepts like her identity and where she belonged. Within her adoptive country, she was faced with harsh anti-Asian sentiments. Long has since founded InterCountry Adoptee Voices, an extensive platform for intercountry adoptee-led organizations and individuals to collaborate, share, and encourage one another. Listen in as Lynelle and I talk about the challenges of intercountry adoption, her experience in a place that wasn't home, and creating a network for adoptees and their families. Let's drop into the story. Well, today on Story of Our Trauma, I'm so honored to bring Lynelle Long onto the show. And she is powerhouse leader of understanding the trauma that can come with adoption through her international organization, InterCountry Adoptee Voices. And I'd like to bring her on now to share her personal story of how she got into this work and came to some of these really important insights. Welcome to the show, Lynelle.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here.
So maybe let's start with, we talked about in the 1990s was when you started to think about the work that you do, but it came out of a personal experience. Can you take us back into your own story and share some of that with us?
Sure. Yeah, I grew up in Australia in the early 70s as a Vietnamese adoptee. I was adopted into a family who had 4 biological children of their own, and I was the middle child. And at that time, like all around the world, a lot of people saw the pictures and the media coverage of Vietnam. And my parents were, I guess, compelled to help, pretty much like what you're seeing in Ukraine now, where you have parents wanting to help children who are displaced and have, have problems because of the wartime. So I was adopted in that era, and I came to Australia. I grew up in rural Victoria on a dairy farm. So for me, my life was quite isolated because I was the only adopted child in that family, and within my community, I was the only person of colour apart from Aboriginal Australians. So my experience growing up was quite isolated, and very much the case where I didn't see anyone else around me who looked like me or who even shared a remotely similar kind of circumstances. So I really struggled with concepts like my identity, where I belonged. I was always singled out, and as much as your adoptive family might love you and treat you like one of their own, it's not the same when you walk out your front door of your family home, because people in your society, people in public, people who you just come across will always make comments. And especially at that time in Australia, when there weren't many Asians in the country, because we had just come out of a White Australia policy, which deterred, Asian immigration. So there was a lot of kind of, I guess, harsh sentiments against Asians. So I was obviously picked out and noticed by the regular Aussies that I'd come into contact with. And I lived that experience of feeling like I didn't belong because people would make overt comments when I would walk into a shop or when I would open my mouth, because my Australian is so Australian. And they'd always say things like, wow, where'd you learn to speak such good English? The comments like that, although people don't mean to be harmful or to, traumatize you in any way, what it does do to an intercountry adoptee is remind you of your difference, that you don't naturally belong here. And so these things that happen to you build up over in your lifetime, and it affects our sense of identity, our sense of where we belong and where we come from. We get asked those questions all the time, and they're quite intrusive.
Right. Yeah. I think for your episode, the theme that I really pulled out was so much deep trauma can happen to a person, even when there is no wrong intention.
That's right.
Start from adopting you out of Vietnam, bringing you into Australia with the best of intentions and love in their hearts, there can still be so much trauma. And the comments that people make,
Mm.
again, not necessarily out of poor intention, can cause so much deep trauma. I don't think people are aware of that. And I know that the materials you sent me were eye opening, and I was
Mhm.
excited to have this conversation. One of the examples was a lot of people will say, "Oh, you should be so grateful that you were adopted."
Mm.
And you had powerful voices of adoptees saying, you know, that is a complicated thing. Can
Mm.
you talk about that aspect in your own story and with some of the adoptees that you have supported?
Yeah. So for me, when people would say, oh, you're so lucky or you should be so grateful you're here, um, eh, what that does is it says to an adoptee, put aside any other feelings that you might have because
Hmm.
just focus on the benefits. But for an adoptee, we have all these losses that people don't understand. Like most people just can't even fathom what it would be like to live if you were not with your family of origin. Whereas for us, that's our everyday reality. We are placed into a family of strangers who we mirror nothing like them. We have no DNA that unites us. So you don't get all of those tiny little nuances that are similar that come through genetically,
Hmm.
and we just don't have that baseline of sense of we belong here that everybody else has who is naturally born to their families. And so that in itself, that sense of displacement, very much is a trauma that
It
we have
is.
to live with.
Hmm.
And most people just don't understand that. So it would really shut down any thoughts of,
Hmm.
for me, but I've got all these losses because I wasn't brave enough at that stage in my life to kind of counter people's sentiments of gratefulness or you've been saved, what a wonderful life you have. And yet I would bury it deep within me. And it wasn't until, my early 20s, late 20s, that all of that stuff that I'd bottled down about my feelings of loss, of not belonging, of being displaced, of not looking like anyone around me, all of those feelings eventually kind of, grew into a mountain over years and became, suicidal depression.
Yep.
So what I'm saying is that when adoptees aren't allowed to talk about the
Hmm.
complex emotions and feelings that we have, yes, we can be grateful. Yes, we can be thankful for being in these amazing countries, but we also
Yeah.
need to have acknowledgement of our losses, our griefs, the lack of knowledge about ourselves. The
That's
very
right.
fact that most people take for granted that your medical background from your family. We
Hmm.
don't even have that. So
Yep.
every time we go to a doctor, we get confronted with, so, do you have a medical history? And we always have to say, no, I'm adopted. I don't know anything about my past. And that's, although it sounds easy to say, for an adoptee, it's quite a triggering event because it brings home again
Yeah.
another time in our life. We don't belong there. We don't fit. It's not our natural place. So that sense of displacement is very strong amongst most intercountry adoptees. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think here in America, we've had this trend for many years, probably prior to the pandemic, mostly of positive thinking.
Mm.
And, that it sounds good on paper to think
Mm.
positively, but the reality is when you think about, oh, you should feel gratitude, it cuts off again all
Mm.
of the other stuff that is also there that is a trauma. And it's like saying to you, you know what? I really don't get it. I really
Mm.
don't understand. I only see the world from my own framework that, oh, here you are and you have these opportunities, but I don't see all of the loss. I don't see all of the struggles to fit in. And I don't think, Lynelle, it's a measure of bravery. You said I wasn't brave enough to speak
Mm.
up. I think it's child development at that age. No kid would. You are
That's so
here.
right.
You are dependent on a host family, your new
Mm.
family. You are in a culture where you are in many ways so isolated, let alone
Absolutely.
being raised in a rural area, in a even further sort of isolating environment. There is no kid I can imagine that would say, hey, you know what? Really, it's more complicated than that.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
Let me tell you, let me tell you about the soul ache that I have that I live with every day.
Yes.
because I am
That's a great
disconnected.
way to describe it. A
Yeah.
soul ache. It is. Yeah.
And when you talk about the doctor, going into the doctor, one of your the adoptees that you work with who shared a story, shared her experience with being asked, "Can I do some tests? Would you like to learn about yourself? Can we do some genetic testing?" And how validating that was
Mm.
to have a physician say, "You know what? Yeah, I'm not going with that script of no, you don't have a medical history. You do, but you just don't know it. So let's
Yes.
see if we can align and figure it out."
Yes.
What are some of the other things that people can say that are helpful, since "you should be so grateful" is absolutely unhelpful?
Yeah, it's just nice if people were actually just to validate, wow, and say, wow, that's so heavy and so much to carry,
Mhm.
because it is like our burden. It's a heavy weight that we carry to try and sift through all that we've lost and all that we've gained, and try to make sense of it all, and try to make sense of how did we get here in this country that we're not even born in. Um, so having someone just to validate the complexity, the heaviness of it, really just says, I hear you, and it's okay to be where you are at that in that
Mhm.
space in your journey of trying to figure it out, because it's not like a linear path. It's, for so many of us, we talk about our adoption journey as being, it is lifelong. There are layers
Yeah.
and layers that you unravel the older you get. So for instance, when I was young, I dealt a lot with racism. That was a really core issue when I was young, because kids at school can be cruel, mean. They
Mhm.
can say stuff that hurts. When I got older, as a young adult, it really became apparent to me that I had these wounds and these soul issues when I was dating partners, and
Mm.
realizing that my stuff was getting in the way of being able to have a normal, healthy attachment relationship with an intimate person.
Mhm.
Then, as I got older, had children of my own, and having a child of your own as an adopted person is a massive trigger. For the first time in our life, when we are pregnant, carrying our first child, it is the only time in our life where we really get a full sense of, oh my God, this is
Mm.
what my mother must have gone through. And then when we give
Mm.
birth to that baby and we think, how did she give us up? It just blows your mind with how complex that is. And it really brings home to a lot of female adoptees, just what our mothers have gone through in terms of even contemplating relinquishing your
Absolutely.
child. It's huge, it's massive. And then as we get older, and as our children get older, as our adoptive parents die, that's a massive trigger point that really brings up a lot of our original loss
Mm.
again. So, what I'm trying to paint a picture of is that our adoption is a lifelong journey.
Right.
Being adopted, coming to terms with what it all means, has so many layers to it. It's not just an issue that happened to us when we arrived in our families in America or
That's
Australia or
right.
anywhere else. It is a lifelong journey that you're continually unraveling and unpacking
Yeah,
and
it's
coming to
not
terms
a
with.
single trauma event. It's
No,
a slow
it's
rolling,
ongoing. It's
lifelong
ongoing.
trauma.
Yes.
Even when the adoptive family is loving and kind,
Yes.
the adoption journey is uh, so traumatic,
So
regardless.
complex still,
Hmm.
and I get calls all the time from adoptive families who, they thought their child was quite well adjusted and fine, and all of a sudden they're suicidal, or they've suicided, and they just didn't see it coming, and they're
Hmm.
just at a loss as to what was all that about. Why didn't I see it earlier? And part of my mission and what I try to do in my organization is try to help equip adoptive parents to understand the full complexities of what your child can possibly go through. And I'm not saying that every child and every adoptee is going to
Uh huh.
experience
Right.
adoption in the same way,
Right.
because we all experience it very differently. But I can bring to you the breadth of experience that our network, that is global,
Uh huh.
shows and demonstrates. And through showing you the breadth of the complexity, it hopefully prepares you for worst case scenarios like suicide, so that you can prevent that as much as possible. Yeah.
Well, and the stories that the adoptees shared that I watched that you sent me were so
Mm.
powerful. And the reason why I won't ever go back to just one on one therapy as a trauma psychologist is because I believe that the things that you are doing, the things that I want to do with this podcast, are the way of scaling healing and insight for people
Mm.
because they watch those stories and they say, oh, that's my experience. Right. So,
Yes.
we are not adoptees, we are not all orphans. And starting from that point, the complexity of how was it that I was given up? What were the conditions? Trying to unravel that when you don't even have all of the information. Uh,
Mm.
and it might be stored, in the body, that feeling of being rejected. And maybe,
Absolutely, it is.
you weren't rejected. Maybe that's not even the story, but
Mm.
it tends to be the story we tell ourselves
Mhm.
until we have other information.
That's right.
Right. So let's take a short break. And when we come back, I want to talk about how joyous events, typically joyous events, like birthdays, can be a real
Mhm.
triggering event for adoptees. You can break the barriers of mental health. Given Hour's mission is to provide help and hope to those in need. As of 2021, Given Hour's volunteer network of mental health providers has delivered over 360,000 hours of barrier-free, no-cost mental health care. With a small gift of $5, you can give help and hope. Your generosity will allow Given Hour to deliver confidential mental health services and vital education tools. Thank you for your support, because mental health is just as important as our physical health. Visit www.givenhour.org to learn more or to donate. And we're back with Lynelle Long. And after the break, I wanted to ask her about how events like birthdays can be actually trauma triggers for some adoptees and really very complicated in and of themselves. Can you share some of those insights, Lynelle?
Yeah. So for myself, for example, I mean, most people just assume that we are like, non-adoptees, that we know our birth date, that we know where we're born, that we know date, time, who our mother is, all of those key essential facts that make up your sense of identity. Well, there are adoptees like me who exist where we don't know that information and you can't take it for granted. So when we have a birthday, it can trigger all of these questions that we are just filled with from the moment we know that we're adopted. Who was she? Where was I born? Why did she give me up? Under what circumstances were there? And is my date correct? So all of these little things that most people take for granted, I don't have. So when I had my birthday when I was growing up as an adoptee, young, I really struggled on my birthdays because my family weren't aware that those questions and thoughts are running through my head. And I didn't grow up in a family where it was really open to be able to talk about adoption. In fact, we never talked about adoption. And that was not a good thing because it meant that I was living this experience of soul confusion and complex questions that I didn't have anywhere to speak to or speak with about them. So I just struggled alone as a young kid, not knowing what to do with all of these questions and emotions. And you can kind of see how that bottles up and accumulates over years if you get to your mid-20s and you end up feeling quite suicidal because it's just so much. It just feels bigger than Ben Hur then because you've never actually started to unpack it. Yeah, so hopefully that makes a bit of sense.
It does. It does. And one of the things that you had also said is a strong theme is that life isn't always better after being adopted. Life is different.
Different, very
Can you
different.
talk about that and the importance of making a shift in that understanding?
Yes, it's such an important point, because so many people make the assumption of, oh, but you've got a better life here, haven't you? And people are only thinking of our material, educational, kind of survival, Maslow's hierarchy, basic needs. Yes, we have better food, shelter, clothing, education, but a big part of what makes us up as to who we are is our soul component, our
Right.
emotional component. That is heavily missing, despite what the best that our adoptive families can give us. Our sense of belonging actually sits with, in our soul as to who we are and where we come from and who we belong to. We need to be able to hold that hand in hand with our adoptive life together to actually be able to integrate both aspects of our beginnings and our current life in order for us to be able to move forward in a healthy way. And it's when you get raised in a family where that whole part of our soul and all the questions and the thoughts and emotions that we
Yep.
hold, when they're not allowed to be explored and exist, that's when you end up with, more significant mental health issues because you're basically
Course.
shutting off one whole half of who you are as a person and not allowing it to exist. It is so important for us all to understand our beginnings in order for us to be able to move forward as a person and to become, who we're meant to be.
That's
And
right.
it's so important for families to talk about, the situation that we came from and the fact that you can see it now actually in the current war, with Ukraine and Russia, where when we demonize a country, and this is what happened too in the Vietnam War because of the communist versus the democracy
Right.
kind of ideology fights, when a country and a culture and a whole nation gets demonized, and when you're born from that and you get raised outside of that in a Western world that says they were wrong, they had the wrong ideology, they had the wrong thinking.
Right.
You as an adoptee, how can you not help but internalize I'm one of them?
Exactly.
So
Right.
I must also be bad, terrible, because somehow we justify a war against these people, this culture, this ideology because it's wrong. And that's how deep it goes in terms of an adoptee from a different country, starting to unpack and unravel all of what our adoption actually means and symbolizes. I could talk about countless different examples
Well,
of,
there's
of
so much
countries.
here. There's so much here I don't want to miss. So, again, it's, without intention, just the fact of being adopted, even when people are well meaning, they have no frame of reference for understanding many people, I think, what it doesn't, what it feels like to lose your origins. And so
Yes.
lost origins is a trauma. And then as you struggle to put the pieces together, the puzzle pieces together, when you're in a country that demonized the culture you came from, the story that people will be telling you over and over about yourself is the story
Mm,
of how your people are seen, that
that's
these
right.
people are not, they are the unacceptable ones. And they,
Hmm.
so of
Hmm.
course you're going to integrate that right into your identity. And
Mm.
I can see how deep that trauma can go to
For me,
not,
a
yeah.
really good example actually is when my parents, because they're so Christian, they told me my whole life, oh, your mother was probably a prostitute in the war. Like,
Mm,
and do you know how I felt about being a
ugh,
Vietnamese woman growing up, thinking, oh, my mother, she's like a whore. She's like,
right.
the bottom of the rung of everything in society from a Christian point of view. Like, oh my God, how could I possibly feel good about myself as a Vietnamese female growing up in a home like that? My parents
Right.
never really thought about what they were saying in terms of how that would impact my sense of self as a female Asian growing up. But we need to get families to stop and think about some of the assumptions that we make about our birth country and culture and about our birth families and actually, question our own perspective and mentality of how we portray that to the adopted child. So it's no wonder that so many of us intercountry adoptees grow up with a very deep sense of shame for who we are and for who our people were, for are, and who our country is, because it can often be this demonization that happens inadvertently and not intentionally. Even when Trump, like with COVID in the last little while, as a leader of America, when he says, the China virus, I mean, all of us Chinese adoptees, Asian adoptees, we're all painted
Hmm.
with the same brush stroke that he does because he's just speaking without really deeply thinking about what he's saying and what it means for those who are of Chinese origins to actually be painted with the same brush stroke that he's doing. And it goes right from the top of our leaders right into our families and our adoptive homes that we get these small instances of people saying things that they
Cause
think are
so
fairly,
much damage,
yeah,
so much
yeah.
damage. And in my work, what I've learned, in working with war fighters and other people who have overcome unimaginable traumas of different types, is that shame actually is more related to suicidality than
Mm,
depression for many
mhm,
people.
mhm.
It's the shame, that like poisonous
Yep.
shame that can build. And that
Mm.
builds when you get isolated with this story of who you are and you've got nobody to say, or not, maybe not. Maybe this is a simple way of looking at the world. And, maybe there is great good in your culture and things that you should be proud of. And
Yes.
maybe we should reconnect you with your lost
Yes.
origins.
Yes.
What can people be doing to not only better understand this, but to functionally take action to support
Mm.
adoptees in exploring their lost origins and reconnecting?
Well, my first suggestion is to really listen, really, really listen to the voices of adult adoptees who live it. Because we, around the world, we are a force en masse. We have so many who have grown up from generations right back to the 1950s up to today's 2020s, where we have so many adult adoptees speaking about what it is we need and how you can best help us to develop, positive sense of identity and connections to our country and culture. What we don't need is, a heap of people who ignore and dismiss what we say. So, very much my organisation, we're trying to actively help people understand how important it is to listen to our voices. And in listening to our voices, it does two things. Not only do you become educated and understand, but it actually helps us to validate our
Mm-hmm.
experiences. Validation is a very, very powerful way for helping us heal.
Mm-hmm.
When we get validated, when we get listened to, when our voices and our experiences are respected and understood, we actually feel like we can move forward from the harm that was unintentionally done, because it gives us a forum to make sense of and to put our experience into something useful. So, for a lot of the adoptees who I bring into government meetings or to post education forums, um, they constantly will share how participating in it alone
Mm-hmm.
just helped them so much to be able to voice their experience and share it, and to have people say, wow, that was so helpful to really hear that and to understand. So yes, I'm trying to explain that it has a twofold kind of benefit when you actually listen to the voices of adoptees.
It does. It starts to bridge that divide, and I'm certainly
Mm,
not the first person to say that, sharing a truth and having someone recognize and be influenced by your truth is healing,
mm.
um, for the person who's sharing the story. But it also is so critical that there's a safe response and that people,
Yes,
right, that
yes,
the people who receive that are not going to receive that in a way that's going to do further damage,
that's
because
right.
it's so vulnerable to share some of those things that I saw in those videos.
Mm,
And, if you had the best situation, you would have a response of people really taking it in and validating it.
mm, mm.
So I'm really, wanting to share some of those videos out. I'd like to post some of those on the show notes page and encourage people to watch those. If you want to learn more about some of the traumas that come with the adoption journey, not just once, but a slow rolling trauma over the lifespan, birthdays become more complicated. And as you were saying, Lynelle, when you are a mother yourself and then your children have birthdays, it is a focal counterpoint to your own traumatic experience of your own birthdays.
Mm.
So there's so many layers to how this can unfold for people over time that I really think we need to better understand this and make sure that we receive this in the right kind of soul based way, because it is a soul ache that we're talking about.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Any final words or thoughts for us that you would like to leave us with about trauma or adoption or anything else?
Oh, there's a lot of words I could say,
I'm
but
sure.
no, that's it for today. And I mean, if people have questions, if people want to learn, I mean, my website is 24 years worth of adoptee voices from every level, whether that be from music, blogs, documentaries, books. I mean, everything is there on our website from a global perspective that pulls together all the resources that we've created in the past 24 years. I mean, there's such a wealth of information there for people to really educate themselves from and really start to understand this a lot deeper and better. So I encourage people to have a look at that and, reach out to us if you have questions or if you have thoughts you want to explore. I'm always open and willing to assist people in understanding our journey a lot better.
What's amazing to me is that you came from an adoption experience that was incredibly isolating culturally, racially, regionally, in terms of where
Mm,
you lived, the family culture you went into, the things that you were told about, even who knows, but things that you were told about your mother. And you then turn all of that pain and suffering into
mm,
being this global connector and healer for all of the people that have experienced this similar pain and brought in like this mosaic of stories and voices and wisdom to this picture. And it just is so beautiful to see how, from your painful isolation, you became a global connector for a whole group of people that have suffered and would suffer in silence without the work you do. So I really salute you for the work you do. And I would really be honored to bring this episode forward in a way that supports your organization.
thank you so much.
Thank you, Lynelle. Thank you to Lynelle for sharing her story with us. The trauma one faces while leaving and adjusting to a new home can be formidable, both intercountry and within a country's borders. Some adoptees may never fully adjust to their new way of life or truly feel like they belong. But with the help of organizations like the one that Lynelle founded, they're discovering their voice and influencing others to understand the challenges they face. We're grateful to Lynelle for bringing a new awareness to these challenges. She's given many people the voice they need to empower themselves to find their inherent belonging and connection within a community of support. Post traumatic stress is not a life sentence. Trauma can be healed with the right insights, the right treatments, and the right support. The story of our trauma is presented by Stella. Visit www.stellacenter.com to learn more about Stella's breakthrough trauma treatments. Please share this episode with people you care about who have been impacted by trauma. And remember to subscribe on Spotify and other streaming platforms.